Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming.
Our meetings, and therefore mobiles, if they could be switched off, because it does interfere with our recording system. And please be seated. Thank you. I have no apologies today. Declaration of interest. I've got one in 8.3. That could be noted. The staff, 8.3 for myself. Any other declaration of interest? Oh.
8.2.
8.2 for Councillor Stojatek. Any other declaration of interest? No. Confirmation of the minutes. Somebody happy to move the minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of January? Moved Alderman Mackenzie, seconded Alderman Soward. Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Soward. All those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. No deputations, no petitions. Community reports. We have one from John Ralph, Launceston Urban Fringe Trial. John, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. Spare members of the council.
Thanks very much, John. Really appreciate that, and thank you for your passion and initiative in doing that, and it's been great to be able, and thank you for our staff for working together with that. It's fantastic to hear that. Well done, and I hope the 6th to the 7th of April goes extremely well for you. We're now going to public question time. Any questions from the public? Yep. Just state your name and address, council address. Yeah, I'll let you. Yep.
I have 3 questions. Before I ask the first, could I stress, please, I'm not a member of any political party or an organised of any political group. My first question is, accepting that there is likely to be a change in federal government following the forthcoming May federal election, is Launceston City Council aware that the Australian Labor Party recently announced their Urban Rivers programme, through which they will, if elected, provide funding of $200 million to protect and restore Australia's rivers and waterways?
I could answer yes to that. We had a meeting with them this morning.
Well, in that case, that scraps my second question, which was, in view of this Urban Rivers programme, will Launceston City Council undertake to contact Mr. Ross Hart, federal member for Bass, at the earliest opportunity to explore the possibility of obtaining some or all of the funds recommended in the Tamar Estuary Management Task Force's Tamar Estuary River Health Action Plan to upgrade Launceston's archaic sewage infrastructure?
Yeah, we continue to have discussions with Ross. As we said, we had one this morning. We'll continue to do that in the next few months.
That's welcome news, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for that. My third question is completely unrelated to that, on cats. Cats continue to wreak havoc amongst native wildlife, particularly birds. Will Launceston City Council advise what action they are taking in conjunction with neighbouring councils to address this problem and cat management in general? And just a footnote for that, I noticed in today's Examiner that the Just Cats Animal Shelter is now at full capacity. They're not taking any more, and is currently unavailable to accept any more cats, which means cats which would be put there would be just done.
Yeah, correct. General Manager, might answer that one for you.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. And Mr. Collier, it certainly is a complex problem that needs resolution. So the council obviously has led the region and worked with the other councils over the last 6 or 8 months to establish the regional cat shelter service for the Northern Tasmania. Previously it was being provided by the RSPCA, which was largely funded by this council and the RSPCA itself and government. So in terms of having a more sustainable solution for cat shelter services, we've certainly worked hard and achieved that moving forward. That said, obviously we've read today in terms of the numbers of the cats that are being surrendered is a significant issue that needs to be resolved. In terms of how that's to be resolved, obviously the state government are the lead agency in respect of the cat management legislation within the state, and they have a dedicated officer that's now employed and is housed in NRM North to assist this region to deal with the issue. We as councils are currently in discussions and are seeking to develop a regional cat management plan that would outline how we would deal with this problem moving forward in a more coordinated way. We think it's more effective to have a regional approach to individual cat management plans, and so again we'll have more information that we can communicate on that in due course as those discussions progress. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Yes, Mr. Mayor and Alderman. Brian Carn, Newstead. I'd like to mention that I attended the inquiry on the Legislative Council over the rail trail on Tuesday, and Robert Raven, who is very vital to the city, turned around and mentioned that we, as a council, the council was not being involved enough in its heritage, and I would have trusted the council and aldermen would turn around and address the issues that Mr. raised. He's had 18,000 visit Bridesdale Estate during December, and a massive 35,000 people visited Bridesdale during January. So it is important for our heritage of Launceston, and I believe we recommend that the council, General Manager and Mayor council's open dialogue with Mr. Ravenscroft because of its importance to the city.
Thank you. Look, we have had dialogue with him in the past. He's actually came and presented to us as a council. We've also, I personally have had discussions with him as well, and we'll continue to have those. So happy to do that. If he wants to give me a call, more than happy to have a discussion with him.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any other questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Michael Robinson, of the Republic of Brisbane Street Mall. I thank you for the answers to the two questions asked at the last council meeting. I have a further question. I wonder if you could confirm my understanding that the proponent, essentially, of the food ban trial or program is council itself. There was a meeting with traders and business owners in the city on the 27th of June 2018, and it was sought from council that activations were proposals for activations were sought by the council. Food bans did not appear in the list of proposals by business or trades at all. It did appear on the agenda item several times as being a suggestion of council officers and council officers alone who kept suggesting food bans in the meeting. Is my understanding correct?
General Manager?
That meeting and any others?
Yep. General Manager?
So just to confirm, the question is that council sought to, is the proponent or that sought to yeah, well, it's certainly, I mean, the council is, in respect of, as part of the city activation program, as part of the City Heart project, the food vans are initiative of that particular program, and clearly it's as a trial to inform future decisions in respect of activation within the city.
It'll come back to council for a decision once we've had the trial.
Thank you. The second question follows on from the question I had about the bronze and marble sculpture in the mall. I've just been able to have a look at it. It does seem to bear the name of the individual as a designer. I mentioned it last time in his child sex crimes, which is currently in jail at the moment. Also, although it doesn't mention it, was that same individual a benefactor and a significant benefactor for that artwork? Second part of the question is, and so it was touched on in the question at the last meeting, is it not appropriate in such circumstances to remove such artwork from public display? Consider doing that. I don't know if you've been asked formally, but I would ask if you would remove.
Well, you have already, and the answer's in there, but we're more than happy to take the additional points on notice, and we'll provide a response to you in due course. Take it on notice. Thank you. Any other questions? No? Public questions on notice are there. So then we move under the provisions of the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act of 1993. Council acts as a planning authority in regard to the items included under agenda item 8, the planning authority. First item is 8.1. We have a speaker for 8.1, Victoria Wilkinson.
Thank you. I'm a visitor from West Langham. And thanks to the council for this opportunity.
Oh, sorry, I need to read the rules, which I forgot about.
Sorry about
my
that.
apologies.
I'll be quick. Only residents, ratepayers or those on the City of Launceston electoral roll may address an item on the agenda. Before speaking, please state your name and address of property owned in Launceston. You may speak for up to 2 minutes. No extension of time is permitted. You must speak for or against the recommendation, not ask questions of councillors or council officers, or attempt to enter debate with councillors or council officers. Statements can only be made either directly relating to supporting the recommendation or arguing against it. Comments and statements are not to be defamatory, offensive or abusive, or be designed to embarrass any person, including councillors or council officers. Statements are not to be repetitive of statements or points already made. Several people speaking a common position should nominate a single speaker on their behalf. The Mayor may ask a member of the gallery to cease speaking if the above procedure are not followed. Following hearing the comments of the gallery, councillors will then consider the item.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't reading that because of where you said you live, because of this. I should do that every meeting, but I understand that. But I think I'm allowed, if the Alderman, the council's happy, we'll allow you to ask the speak as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks to the planning department for facilitating the saving off tap and the shop.
Thanks, Mayor. I do wish to speak to this item, and for a number of pure planning reasons, but also for community reasons, and to reflect on the work of our officers over this period of time. And I want to clarify a couple of points, and it's great to hear a member of the community speak today, but also to have heard the voices over recent weeks and months around the pride that we have in the heritage fabrics of the community, but also the clarity within which the community spoke around that. I think that's it's fantastic, and I would say potentially as a result of a yet to be resolved process of the building height study. I think the building height study actually has consolidated the community around issues of importance, and heritage fabric being one of those. But a couple of points that I wanted to clarify today. As we sit here as a planning authority, we are purely assessing the signage elements of the item before us. And as a result of receiving an application, council sometimes are in a situation where we're able to be aware that something's coming up, to work with applicants in the community around what is reasonable and would be expected, what Launceston expects of developments in our community, and to work with them to get a common outcome. In this occasion, where we receive an application with no forewarning, it is our responsibility to receive it. And I want to comment and commend the applicants for their response, for hearing the community speak, the community for speaking so clearly, but also often our council officers, particularly in planning, they're at the coalface of this pride of what is in the community and how people perceive how things should be dealt with. And I think our council officers in the planning department, led by the planning leaders but also supported by the general manager, have got to a really fantastic outcome here, and it shows what is possible in the current day of this council and the community when we work together, particularly with applicants. There's an element of trust that remains in this, but I think the documentation of the report and the intentions of all parties to this has, as you have said, created a really positive outcome and been able to maintain a really vital element of heritage fabric in Launceston. I support the application before us.
Thank you. Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, I'd like to commend the Speaker for the comments that she made. And again, I'm thrilled at the outcome of this one, but we've potentially dodged a bullet in relation to this because we had a developer who was prepared to listen to the comments that were made, and as the officer said, there are a number of things that they could have just done without a permit, but chose to listen to what was said. So I'm pleased in this particular case that we've actually got a good outcome. We do have a heritage, and I see Mr Finlay up in the back corner there somewhere who often reminds me of the things that we do. Mr Finlay. Sorry, I'll change the... sorry, Jim Dickinson. Sorry, and often reminds us of the heritage value of the city and some things that are missing. And I must admit, prior to the council rising at the last Heritage Advisory Committee council meeting, it talked about trying to accelerate the term in which we did this review to ensure that we don't end up with some outcomes that we will regret into the future. And again, today, just looking at it, I was lamenting the fact that we didn't have something there which said we've got a palette and a scope of things where people can actually choose from to actually redesign and improve our heritage scape as we go through, so that we end up with a heritage walk through there, which would be something we'd be all proud of. So hopefully, through the good officers of this council, we will be able to promote and push that forward at a lot sooner rate than what we've predicted in the past. So I'll take on board with that, but I endorse the applications here today for approval.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Finlay, you wish to close? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. We move on to 8.2. Well, we've got a number of speakers again. So first of all, John Ayres.
Thank you, Mayor. John Ayres, Planning Consultant, GHD of the Planning Group. I'd like to tie my comments to the main issues that have been raised as part of the debate. Firstly, in relation to the status of St Leonard's Road. St Leonard's Road is a Category 5 road. Category 5 roads are primarily access roads for private road. Some may be used for comparatively low frequency heavy vehicle transport. But
Gina Poulton.
Thank you, Mayor, and councillors. My name is Gina Poulton. I'm the business manager at the Tame Valley Launceston. Over the last few weeks since
Thank you. Is anybody happy to move a motion? Move. Well, we can try. What's the amendment?
The amendment is to amend 8A from reading within 6 months of use occurring, the crossover into 368, to replace those words with prior to use commencing the crossover into 368.
You got that clear, Staff? Is there a seconder for that, just so I know before? Thank you. Just in case we go through all this and this.
While that's being done, Mayor, can I ask a question?
Yeah, I'll allow that. Since we've got
just
a mover and a
quick-
seconder now.
Just clarifying the concerns raised by which the entrance, what the actual address of the entrance is, if the officer could do that.
Good, thank you. Director Hurst.
Thank you. There's two accesses. One is at 368 and the other is at 378A. There is some confusion because it's not reflected in our current GIS system that it is 378A and 378B is the adjoining.
Question from the Deputy.
Thanks, Mayor. Notwithstanding the comments made previously, I am wondering, please, just clarity around the assertion of the no standing signs being placed outside some of the residences of St Leonard's Road. Just could we have clarity with regard to that while they're present, and indeed move in perhaps on the image if that is indeed the case?
Thank you. Director Hurst.
Can I just clarify the question, please, Mayor? The question is where the no standing signs are proposed, is that correct?
Yep, so we heard from one of the representatives concern with regard to the no standing signs and indeed the 40-kilometre signs, but particularly the no standing signs outside residents. So I'm just wondering if we could have clarity if that assertion is correct.
Apologies, Mayor. That's actually a detail to come. It's a condition that the plan for those restrictions be approved prior to the use commencing.
Sorry,
so what
The question is where will they be?
So the condition requires public consultation and then that the Director of Infrastructure Services signs off on the final plan. So it's a detail yet to be determined.
But there will be some by the sound of it.
There will be consultation.
Question from Councillor Soward.
Thanks, Mayor. Just as a clarification, a couple of the speakers noted that the road isn't a heavy vehicle road, and Councillor Cox and myself, I know, took a different view to that last time. I'm just wondering if we could have some information around that, given it is a road that is used by log trucks, amongst other things.
Thank you. Director Hurst.
Sorry, Mayor, we're just seeking clarity as to the exact question that's being asked.
So it was about the highway, whether it's used for log trucks, etc.
Well, the advice that is in the report and that was referred to by Mr. Ayres is the advice from State Growth.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor McKenzie, you're moving the motion as is?
I am, yeah.
With that amendment?
The amended motion, yes.
Do you wish to speak?
Look, I would like to speak, and I'd like to thank the proponent for 2 weeks ago agreeing to defer the matter so that further issues could be explored to ensure that we got here with as much clarity as we could. And clearly, there's a bit of deja vu. There's a few more questions being asked again today as we've got here. Having said that, I'm standing here to support the motion on the basis that it meets the planning scheme. There have been a number of issues raised in relation to traffic. Again, there is a traffic impact statement that's been done. There's been a report from State Growth in regards to the fact that it's a Category 5 road and there is statistical information that's provided within the traffic assessment which suggests the number of cars and vehicles that go up and down that road every day. Now, notwithstanding the comments of the people who actually live there, and I accept that your view might not be the same as what State Growth does, we're sitting here as a planning authority trying to do it on the planning issues. We're being advised by the road authority, who is the State Growth, that the road is safe and able to take the traffic that's being driving down there now, and will comfortably cope with the additional number of cars that will come down on that road. It's an interesting question about what amenity looks like as well. And again, my question goes back to the very first thing as to what amenity changes, and when somebody's amenity changes, where there's more people coming into your district, as to whether that's a change of amenity or not. But having said that, I thank the Steiner School for the report that they gave back in relation to the things that they've considered to try and improve the outcomes for the community in general. And note, as they did, I think, in their report, that they're probably one of the few schools in Launceston that actually have their drop-off zones off the street. So all of theirs, and again, if they're going to make it a condition of enrolment, that their students will be dropped off in the prescribed dropping zone, which is off the main road, then that is going to be a lot easier for them to police if that's a condition of somebody coming and enrolling their students there. So whilst it is a change, and clearly having one school next to another school, certainly will create some issues. I understand the 40-kilometre zone has been investigated and been advised that because it's not on the road, it doesn't apply in relation to this particular school, but at some future stage it may be something that's worth warranting a further approach to State Growth to consider doing, because to me it was a matter of just picking up one sign and moving it 500 metres further down the road, which I think would have made some sense. And whilst I hear the issues and sympathise with some of the issues that are being raised by the residents, under a pure planning scheme approval, I believe that the conditions that have been put on this development, that the proposal substantively complies with the planning scheme.
Thank you. Councillor Spencer. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to the people, the residents of St Leonard's who contacted me. I spent this morning, seeing how it was a rainy day, sitting outside the driveway entrance to 378A St Leonard's Road and did my own traffic count. You'll be perhaps pleased to know in that time I saw one log truck, one recycling pickup truck and a 10-yard dumpster in amongst the 53 vehicles that rumbled past between 8:30 and 8:45. But in the next 10 minutes, only 21 vehicles went past. So that means the person who wrote a letter saying that they counted 130 cars between 8:30 and 9:30, which is an average of 26 seconds, between cars makes you realise it's actually a very long time to sit there and let a car go out. Now, the school at St Leonard's opens at 8:55. Certainly there was more people being dropped off prior to that, and the Steiner School opens at 9, so I expect they'll have the same. They will have cars being dropped off. But it's important to realise this is a relocation of the current campus from Station Road, which has 3 schools trying to access it and 3 speed humps. So taking whatever number of cars is currently dropping off the Steiner kids out of that road and moving it to St Leonard's Road is absolutely an advantage for those people in Station Road, as well as putting traffic on a wider road that is St Leonard's. So it just seems to me it's a bit of a no-brainer. This meets all the constraints that you would ever hope for from traffic, because there was never a time that I felt that I could not turn in or out of that driveway. And in the nearly half hour that I sat there this morning, and remember it was a rainy day, so if you're ever going to drive your kids today was the day you were going to do it. So I think that the Steiner School proposal is an excellent one, and I have no problem in supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Soward.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Very difficult to follow Councillor Harris after his interactive display. There are quite a lot. That was good. I won't be bursting into song or doing any mime or anything in my presentation. Jokes aside, I just want to start with a couple of things. I want to touch on the remarks that the business manager, Ms Polton, made. I want to commend her and her team for the work that's gone into their traffic policy that she mentioned. Having worked in schools for a while, it's quite interesting because the hazard that is created when cars arrive with students is created not by the school, it's created by the people driving the cars. So I think that the efforts that the Steiner School are going to, that she's outlined to us, Mr Mayor, in email and also verbally there, I think reflect great credit on her and her team. I'd also want to highlight the effort, and there's been some more paperwork come to us in the last 24 hours from the Steiner School team in terms of alleviating any fears councillors might have about this, and I commend all of those people that went to the trouble of taking the time to address those issues. The only other thing that I want to mention, and I don't want to go into what I said last time and repeat that, I'm still concerned, and I do note in the documentation in front of us on page 30 of our agenda that it is a Category 5 road as defined by state growth, and as an earlier speaker said, they're primarily access road for private properties. Some may be used for comparatively low frequency heavy vehicle transport. St Leonard's Road is not a preferred transport route by the Department of State Growth. Now, that to me, Mr Mayor, as someone who definitely isn't a traffic engineer, is a very nice definition that sits comfortably in the State Growth Handbook of Definitions. What that translates to in reality isn't always the same thing. It's not a preferred transport route by the Department of State Growth, but I could say it's certainly a preferred transport route by people that drive log trucks, having travelled that road and so forth. And I'm sure, as Councillor Harris and others would note, you can go there at different times and see different things. I was out there last year speaking to some representatives of the St Leonard's Primary School, and there were certainly a fair few log trucks around that day. There's also significant work going on out there, or it's nearly concluded out that way at the moment, in the White Hills area. I come back to my remarks that it's categorised in a certain way by state growth, but I guess, Mr Mayor, and we know as councillors and our officers know, that just because something's categorised or notarised as something doesn't mean the users use it the same way. We have that. Director Eberhard knows very well, and I'm sure he has a wry smile on his face when he gets emails from me around trucks using Cimetiere Street out of sight of hours they're supposed to. Well, just because it says they're supposed to do it doesn't mean it happens. So that's all I want to say. I'll be having a talk to State Growth in the not too distant future and getting some more information to help my learning around this, and perhaps I can assist in helping their learning around this as well, in terms of what's on paper doesn't necessarily translate into reality.
Yep, thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Cox.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'll start with where Councillor Sauer stopped and talk about state growth. It is a Category 5 road. It is a recommended heavy vehicle route by State Growth back in the days when they were dire, and it was done under the Director Mark Addis. That was when the pulp mill was being viewed as a possible potential, and that's why it was created. So let's clear that up. State Growth is saying that road can take additional traffic. Of course it can. Of course it can. It's a Cat 5 road. They're saying they're not that fussed about it, and they're not. But what they are saying is that they want some no parking spots put in, which we're not sure where they're going to go. I actually feel like the Grinch of Steiner here. I haven't changed my view. I do thank Steiner for the work and the effort that they've put in, and I thank them for the answers to the questions. It would be helpful if you did get the 40k school zone. You won't, and you may into the future. We've got to take this as we see it at this particular time. Councillor Harris mentioned about the lack of number of trucks at that particular time. Let me remind you of something. It takes one vehicle. And I can tell you that there are 30 instances, 30, in the last few years where children have been involved in very serious to casual instances. Didn't take 30 vehicles, it took one vehicle. The other thing that I've got that I respect Steiner for is you're trying to manage where your pick up and drop off points will be. And I think that's great, but you can't mandate it. You can't make parents do it. There will always be an instance where people will stop on the yellow line, they'll drop the kids off, and I'll give you a good example. This is a true story. A few years ago, there was a school in a similar situation, and the school went back at the beginning of term, and one particular mother was most irate because people were parking on the no parking sign. They weren't going into the car park where they were meant to go, and they were travelling too fast in the school area, which did have a 40k zone. An arrangement was made for the police to attend that school on the next day. The first person booked on that day was the irate woman. And the reason was she was running late for work. So you can mandate as much as you like, and I respect that, and I wish you well with it, but you can't make it. There's nothing more uncontrollable than an excited child. And history has shown, as I said, in the past there have been sad instances where that has come to fruition. I really don't think there's any more I need to add to this. As I said, I feel like the Grinch of Steiner. I don't want to be that. But in all consciousness, as I said before, I don't believe this is the right place for a school. I don't believe any school, Steiner, XYZ school, I don't care. The access is onto a main road, busy, otherwise whatever. There are vehicles there. It's not controlled. People will, most will do what you ask them to do. Unfortunately, the majority of sad events are by people who don't do what they're asked to do. So on that note, I unfortunately can't support this.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Mayor. And firstly, thank you to Steiner for the clarification of some of the details following the meeting at last week. I was able to provide certainty around the numbers and the intentions of the development of the school, which was important in considering the application possibly last week, but this week. And secondly, I want to acknowledge that in any circumstance where a planning application becomes before council and representors are involved, often representations are concerned with change, the impacts that will happen as a result of change because of the development that's to occur. For me, with the clarification of the details and the certainty of what is being approved in terms of numbers and use at the site, I am now in a position to be comfortable to support the application. To support an application for 102 students with 12 full-time staff members. But I do want to say at this point that in the event that an approval is granted today, and I'm not sure how the numbers will fall on that, but in the event that there is an approval granted today, that in no way signifies likelihood of an approval in the future for any expansion, and that any future application before council would have to be considered on its merits and its impacts at that time. I acknowledge the concerns of the residents in terms of the traffic and the impact and the risk. I believe that the approach to the car parking and the drop-off and pick-up off-site is quite unique in terms of the way a school operates. I believe that the concerns of the impact of a development are felt as real by the people that live in the immediate area, but I believe that the development of a school within the confines of our planning scheme, with the clarity of the information provided, warrants approval today.
Thank you. Any other speakers?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you to councillors who spoke before, especially to Councillor Cox for your great knowledge in regards to roads. No one can argue against that. My, I suppose, observation is show me a road that's outside of school that's safe. And yes, there might be in 40-kilometre zones, yes, there might be speed humps. I live very close to Abbott Street. I do school pick-up and school drop-off. There's 4 schools in that road. If you go 2k kilometre, you've got nearly 7 schools. Pinkwhite Road, Abbott Street at chock-a-block, 8:30, 9 o'clock, and obviously 2:30, 3 o'clock. So the movement there is phenomenal. Obviously outside Skype it's even worse. And I look at the Steiner School, or regardless if it's the Steiner School, but I look at that location, I think that's a great match. Yes, people might not like to live next door to a school when there hasn't been one there before, but I think from a safety point of view, they've done a great job in their design of having that off-street drop-off and pick-up. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Mayor. I want to thank the Business Manager for the additional details with regard to the questions that were posed at the previous meeting. And I think the questions were genuine. And from my perspective, notwithstanding what Councillor Finlay has said, the certainty around the numbers is important. Of course, we can only assess based on the detail contained within the development application, but a school is a living, moving beast. And what it means is that students who are in one grade progress to the next grade. And so I am very mindful of the fact that in standing today and in asking for that additional information and in seeing it in black and white, that the school will have a maximum of 102 students. And certainly in the years that are to come, I'll be very mindful of that 102 figure. Because we can only assess based on the figure that's provided, and if, like the imagery that was on display at the Town Hall style open day suggests, and there are plans for expansion, the expansion will need to occur within the 102 cap that's being approved pending, but that looks like it might be approved today. The thing that I have taken from this is that safety is paramount and that the drop-off arrangements that are being proposed are unique, and I think the Steiner School are to be commended for that, for listening to the concerns and implementing something through their model and through the model of educational offering that they provide that can be monitored and can be implemented into their program. I think for me, the thing, and hopefully for the Steiner School that's resonated out of this, is there's still some neighbourly relations building to occur. And what I'm hopeful of today, irrespective of the outcome of the decision, we've got a lot of people who, at the moment, for whatever reason, feel as though they haven't been consulted with potentially their new neighbours. And in my learning from university and my learning from education, the Steiner model is certainly one that needs to have an embraced community around it in order to prosper. So I hope and trust, whatever the outcome of today's decision, but potentially if it's a positive one, that strong engagement with neighbours in St Leonard's and a sense of belonging for all members of the St Leonard's community, those that have been there for 50 years and longer and those that are moving there, will continue to be a core focus of the offering of the school.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mayor. I commend the work that you've done over the past few weeks, and I suppose I rise to just express my conflict over this particular decision. I agree with Councillor Cox that this it's a good location for a school, but when you take in the wider context, all the problems that we're discussing today become apparent. I suppose we can't take into consideration whether it's going to be a 40-kilometre-an-hour zone, just like we can't take into consideration the potential behaviour of parents in dropping off or picking up their kids. So we're left back with the application as it stands, and so ultimately I think I will be supporting that application. What I would like to address, and I suppose I'm not expecting an answer from this, but just to raise the awareness, is the process that goes on when something like a school, or it might be a private hospital or a clinic, decides that they want to purchase some land and put in a development application. Do we as a council have a point where early in that process, I understand how difficult this would be, but to identify that a problem like this is potentially arising. It's a fraught area, I know, because people have to make a purchase based on their plans and things like that. But in a case like this, we've escalated to a point, and even just looking at that map there, and you see the big paddocks out to the side and everything, and you go, well, potentially there might be so many areas that a school like this could go in. It's transpired that this is the way it is going to be. Well, if it's supported today. So I suppose it's just a comment that if there's any way the council can improve that process early on in the piece, I'd like to, to see that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Mackenzie, you wish to close?
I will, thanks, Mayor. And look, Thank you to all of the councillors who have spoken. I guess the fact that we've heard all the things that we've heard would say this is that we've all done our due diligence in regards to how it is. It's been difficult in some respects because we can actually appreciate the comments that have been made by the neighbours. We can appreciate the issues with road safety. Most of us have had children and therefore understand the issues with it. I like Councillor Daking's comments about all schools have danger around them. Wherever you go, there is a dangerous situation every time there is a school because kids get excited, they jump out of cars, do all sorts of things. The one thing I find in relation to that, and Councillor Cox made the comment about that you can't mandate, the school's gone as close as they can to mandating an activity for their parents by saying when they sign up to come take their children to the school that they will adhere to the rules which are bring their kids into the drop-off zone and take them out. Now, whether that happens exactly, and if somebody's running late for work, that may not happen, and that's where, unfortunately, issues can potentially happen, but that's life. Unfortunately, these things happen wherever we go in life, and it doesn't need to be outside of school. It could be anywhere that any of us could do something because reactionary, we've got to do something in a hurry, so we do it. So the reality of it is I think the Steiner School have done its best endeavours to try and assume that parents won't do it unless we give something to give them incentive, and therefore by educating them and mandating as part of their enrolment process that they will do that. We're also talking this school of a limit of 102 students. At the moment I think there are about 70 there, so the school in itself is quite small, a lot more manageable than a 300 or 400 size school than, so therefore the ability to be more in touch and closer to your students and your parents of those students is probably going to make the ability for the almost mandating to actually happen because there is such a small community in itself. Again, I like win-wins in everything, and clearly out of here today there will be winners and there will be losers based on the comments that have been made today. But I also like to take on board the comments made by Councillor Gibson, that if this does get up today, that there is a stronger engagement between the school and its community to ensure that some of the concerns that have been expressed by that community are actually listened to and heard, and whatever mitigation put in place to deal with things. And the final thing I'd just like to say is, as a planning authority, we have to make decisions based on what's in front of us today in relation to the planning rules. Some of those things roll over into other things which we actually don't control in making our decisions. We've received information from authorities such as Department of State Growth, from GHD, so we've had experts give us advice in regards to traffic management and the traffic on there. So we do have to look at those things and say, okay, well, we're making an informed decision based on that advice that we've given. Now, whether we challenge that advice or not, the reality of it is that's what State Growth are giving us, the statistics that are actually happening on that road, and therefore that's what we've got to base our decision on, I believe. We can anecdotally think it's something different, but the reality of it is that's what it is. Well, I better sit down then.
I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. Those against? So that's 3 against, the rest are 4. The motion is carried.
Okay, we're moving to item 8.3. The first speaker that I have listed is Claire Gregg. Christine Gleeson. Thank you. Are there any additional speakers? Looking for someone to move. Councillor Soward, which motion are you moving?
Thanks. Thank you, Deputy. I'm actually looking to test the table, and I have already circulated an alternative motion. That is actually a motion for approval. I've circulated that to all councillors, and the proponents have seen that and are happy with that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Soward. Looking for a seconder of that motion. Councillor Spencer, thank you. Councillor Soward, do you wish to speak?
Thanks, Deputy. I do wish to speak to this, but I think I'll start my remarks just commending both of the previous speakers. I think Claire spelled out very, very clearly around the infill side of things with this, and Christine in her remarks talked about the work that's been done so far and the positive feedback that's been had by the community on that. I know, Deputy, that a number of councillors here remember the previous iterations this has come to us with and the concerns that we've had, and particularly the concerns that neighbours have had. And I can tell you, as someone who lives very close by, those people don't always take the time to ring the council. They wander up and knock on your door and tell you about it. Well, I've got a confession to make. I have had people make comments to me about this development, nothing but favourable ones, nothing but positive ones. And the issues at the moment, it's a good issue to have local tradespeople parked legally, I might add, in the street, working on site. So positive there. What Deputy has come back in this alternative motion, and I will just expand on this for the purposes of those listening. I had some concerns when I saw that our original motion was indicating a refusal. So I did contact Director Hurst, and I really, really appreciate the work her and her team did in coming up with the alternative motion. I then presented that to the proponents, and they indicated to me that they were happy with it. I'm not going to go obviously read through that because councillors have it in front of them, but it does spell out very, very clearly the things that need to happen in terms of what needs to be amended and so forth. It spells that out very, very clearly. I think the earlier speakers, Deputy, summed up very, very well that this type of housing isn't everyone's cup of tea, you know, but no type of housing is. Some people don't like having a 50 square house on 10 acres. That's not their thing either. What this does, it's infill development, and Deputy, I know there are many around this table, and there are another probably 20 out there in the community who wouldn't mind being around this table, who went to an election and talked about how great infill development was, how great it was to use the spaces we have. Well, here's one we prepared earlier. It's here. It's in front of us. We're making a decision on it today. It's not everyone's cup of tea. I get that. Again, I'm not hearing any complaints from the neighbours. I'd also say, Deputy, and I know that sometimes really obvious things you shouldn't have to say them, but you do, to make the point, developers like Boyd and Christine wouldn't be building this type of housing if there wasn't a demand for it. They wouldn't just get up and think, oh, well, I'm going to go and throw X, Y, Z amount of dollars and take 3 years of my life and build something just for filling in time. This is a type of housing that is popular. It's a quality build. It's something that's definitely needed in our city. And as they quite rightly pointed out, not too far from the city, both in terms of the great services and amenities we have, the hospital, which is one of the major employers in the city located close by. Not only do I know that because I drive past it, but I know it because people who work there park outside my house. So I know that it's there. I know that that's a big employer. I think it's a great sensible alternate motion, and I look forward to the discussion. I really do hope councillors see fit to support it. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Soward. As the seconder, Councillor Spencer. Reserve your right. Any additional contributions? Councillor McKenzie.
Thank you, and I must admit, when I first read it, I thought, oh, this is great. No representations. We don't actually have anybody talking at me from over in the gallery and telling me what a bad decision we were about to make. And then I find the council decide that we shouldn't be doing it. And I take my hat off to the council to actually review things and take it seriously, even though there are no representations, to actually go through the process to make a determination, which would have been probably a lot easier for them to say, tick the box, move on, because they had reservations in relation to the development. I've spent quite a bit of time, and like Councillor Soward, I don't live very far from the property in question, so I took my dog and off I went the other day and had a bit of a wander around and looked at the area, and I know that the area is made up of lots of small buildings in lots of different places, and it's used and frequented by people who probably like to walk to work or want to go to utilise the hospital as part of their employment. So as a consequence of that, there's lots of that, and maybe some of these people who park their cars outside your place now, Councillor Soward may now live there and not have to park there. But fundamentally, these units, I believe, have been dealt with. They've been built of a quality nature, and you can see that by the ones that have been built on the left-hand side or the town side of it, which are already under construction. As you walk past there, are of good quality, and certainly the design. Looking at those on the plans, consider that these other developments are of high quality as well. I looked at parking. I looked at open space. I looked at the configuration of it, and yes, there's a lot of hard space in there and a lot of not much impervious. I think that's the right word, impervious area, which means it's mostly hard stand in there, which means it's going to be a bit austere as you walk out there, unless you happen to live in Unit 5, which has got a nice little grassy bank up the back there. So I can understand that, but some people want to do that. Some people want to live there, and whilst we can't look at public open space that's right next door to say that that's going to impact it, the reality of is Coronation Park is probably 500 metres from the place in question, and it's a magnificent place. I walk the dog through there quite regularly, and seeing the people frolicking out there on Saturday or Sunday whenever I went through it, it's a great place for people to do that. So if they want open space to go and enjoy an area away from their houses, then there's something not very far away in relation to it. So I commend Alderman Soward, Councillor Soward, for bringing the amended motion. Whilst I understand and listen to the comments made by the officers this morning, I'm of a view that I think that we should approve the application.
Thank you, Councillor McKenzie. Question from Councillor Harris.
Just to be confident of what we're voting on here, the amendment will reduce the number of parking spaces for visitors from 2 to 1. I just want that confirmed, if I can.
Thanks. From 3 to 2, it will reduce the visitor number parking spaces from 3 to 2.
Supplementary?
If I can have a supplementary then, so how many for 12 units is the number of parking spaces that should be allowed?
Clarification, how many would normally be required? Is that what the question is? For visitor parking. 3.
Any additional contributions or questions? Councillor Finlay.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. I think it was Councillor Walker that spoke to the previous item and said it's challenging sometimes when there are conflicting positions for us to consider, and I reflect on the great contributions that former Alderman Williams used to make, and I remember vividly one day she saying that this is going to be hard work. We're going to have to make a decision here, but our job is to work hard and to figure this out. So this one, I think, is a clear example of a potential, in some people's mind, borderline decision. Councillor Mackenzie has reflected on the work of the officers, and it is rare that officers firstly bring forward a motion for refusal and secondly bring forward a motion of refusal when there are no representations. And as a councillor who's been at the table for a long period of time, that always in the first instance causes me to take heed of the advice. Where we are definitely demonstrating we're a council that is seeking to support development at the opportunity that's reasonably presented, that we were actively supporting infill development, that Councillor Soward suggests that many of us promoted the supporting of infill development through the election. Many of us also supported quality in terms of what council and what the community expect for our community going forward. What are the things that make us a valued community with great amenity, that we strive for excellence in the things that we do, and that we seek to provide a great community of livability. So one thing on itself isn't important, it's how it fits in a full mix of considerations for a resident, but also for a community, local and more broadly. I'm in a position where I'm challenged by the recommendation we're considering now in terms of approval, because although seeking to support a motion for refusal, which is something that you need to take seriously, I feel that there is sufficient reasons for a refusal motion to be supported. And I want to work through my reasons for that unless I hear valid and strong reasons from another councillor, that I would be seeking not to support the motion before me today. And one is that I personally believe that this council absolutely support infill development, and in doing so seek to support the personal amenity of the residents living in developments that are approved, but also the more localised amenity. I believe that, and for me personally, I go through a sort of a waterfall of consideration in terms of the density of the development, but then for me, solar access and private access to private space is really important. And I recognise that on this development in particular, the access to softened, landscaped spaces around the development itself, and then the access to the required amount of private space, is where there is challenge by the density of the development that's being proposed. When you look at the renders of the three-dimensional representation of this development on the site, there's no doubt that this site lends itself and in fact has an active approval for infill multi-property development for this site. However, for me personally, and I know the previous active application before us had a prior iteration where there was first an application refused and then an amended, a different one come forward with less townhouses to develop. That in the event that this application still met all the expectations combined from the community about infill and had potentially one less townhouse on it, it would provide for some formalised landscaping, and in particular to the amenity of the community, and why there are no representations. I think we could have an item before us with 50 representations and it still meet all the requirements of the scheme and we approve it. or in this instance we have no representations but still need to meet the requirements of the scheme. And for me, the presentation to the street, where the number of properties proposed reduces the opportunity for landscaping between the street frontage and the first hard wall of the first unit, is not a great outcome, and that then the landscaping opportunities around the site and the private space for each individual resident. So in speaking today, I want to ensure the developer that this is an ideal site for infill development. I believe either the existing active DA or a DA that is submitted with one less unit would be appropriate, and would have, I think, support of council, would have, subject to what it looks like, would be possible to be supported. But given the details as outlined in the recommendations by our officers in the report, unless I hear something different from another council at the table, I'm unlikely to be able to support the application before us that's been proposed by Councillor Soward.
Thank you, Councillor Finlay. Councillor Daking.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Obviously, that we've all looked at it, we're all a little bit conflicted, I think, about it. I look at it from a slightly different point of view. There's definitely a market for this type of development, especially in that location. If you just jump on and try and find rentals in the inner CBD, especially South Launceston, you can hardly find one. You go one step further, you go to Airbnb, which a lot of people jump on, that short-term style accommodation, which I'm sure some of the units will probably be taken up with that. You just can't find anything on Airbnb or stays. Like it's a great thing for the town with that booming, soon to be booming economy. But we need stock, and we need stock in this kind of location. I seriously think taking 1 unit or 2 units away is not going to do any difference to this kind of development. What's 1 unit going to do? We're going to take maybe 2 people away from living in that apartment or that unit. Car parking, I understand, but the more we talk about infill development, the more issues we're going to talk about car parking. You go houses on York Street, houses up George Street, big houses, no off-street car parking at all. I know there's houses in South Launceston, Balfour Street, again, that don't have any off-street car parking. So we're talking about, we've got all the cars off the road, and we've still got a few for our friends. So hopefully we've got a few friends to come around. In regards to where this style of development is going, it's where the future's headed. I know for myself, my parents live in a gated community. Off the street, there's 11 townhouses. There's fake grass, all hard stand. They're semi-retired. They don't want to look at mowing lawns or cutting trees down. So I think from a hard stand point of view, I personally don't have any issues with that because we're not going to be living in there ourselves, or we might decide to do that. But again, that's up to the people that decide to move in there. But I think we need to provide the market with, and the developers with, the opportunity to build these, what I see is a great need, and especially in this location. Others have talked about walking distances to the hospital and walking distances into the CBD. So essentially, you might not need too many cars if you decide to live there. I think moving ahead, we will be faced with more and more of these decisions in regards to these developments. They're not going away. Car parking, well, we all know that. That's not going away. But I think we as a council, we need to be bold in our decisions to move ahead. And that may or may not sit well with all the town planning authority decisions, but I think we've got an opportunity here to make a decision and see some great development in South Launceston.
Thank you, Councillor Daking. Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Can I just, as a point of clarity, we're discussing an amendment. Does a vote on, does this amendment become the development application? Sorry?
This is a live motion.
Yes.
This motion will be voted on. Yes. Subsequent to the outcome of that, we may go back to the recommended motion or an alternate as provided.
I understand. I take the point, saying, of course, commend anybody who's wanting to do business in Launceston. I think everyone would agree about population density, about the benefits of infill, And yes, and certainly people, would choose to live in a development such as this. But, I also do take on board our officers' due diligence and hard work, and I am inclined to agree with, and I would like some clarity from the officers just in regards to the ratio of density and how much past our recommended ratio this development goes, and also, again with the if it's impermeable, is this what we're calling it? Nature of the ground, of the finish. Again, how far past that this development goes. I understand that you have your own constraints when you're doing a development such as this. You obviously want to maximise your position, but my personal concerns do include the streetscape, and also issues now, especially with this live motion, to do with parking, with the access to the parking being right at the rear of the property for visitor parking, and I understand you'd have your own constraints when it comes to that design and things like that, and I appreciate that. I would, and you may look at it and say, well, if we were to remove one dwelling, that makes it no longer a viable option. That may be the case. I'm fully supportive of infill developments, but I'm also fully supportive of us improving the sustainable quality of our livable city. So, yeah, I'm done, but if the officers could just clarify that ratio of density that was spoken about for the benefit of all councillors, that would be good.
Thanks, Councillor Walker. Director Hurst. Mr. Jamieson.
Within the attachments is a table which shows the density of all properties within 100 metres of the site. So the site is calculated at, so the area would have a density of 1 to 451. The acceptable solution under the planning scheme is 1 to 325, and the application is proposed at 1 to 171. And the test under the planning scheme is about whether that density is compatible with the surrounding area.
Thank you, Mr. Jamieson. Councillor Walker, any additional questions?
Yes, and I suppose, thank you for that clarification. And in this case, yes, it is partially, in relation to its surrounding area, but it's also, in relation to the quality of living for the people that will live there. And I accept that people will live there, but it's also our job to maintain some consistency. Thank you.
With a question mark on the end, isn't it? Noted. Thank you. Councillor Dawkins.
Thank you. Look, I am going to exercise caution over this particular planning development. I won't be supporting Councillor Soward's alternate motion. I think that what's changed my mind, I was sitting on the fence, and it was when Councillor Daking said we're going to see more of these. Well, if we are going to see more of these, and that will be wonderful because we do need to see more development and more infill development, it has to be within the planning scheme. It's as simple as that. A lot of effort has gone into the interim planning scheme to ensure that it does take account of Launceston's capacity and requirements and the amenity for the community around these proposed developments. And if we don't adhere to it and, in fact, double the density and expect that to pass at the council table, I think we are really verging on being a reckless council at this point. So I will not be supporting the alternate motion.
Thank you, Councillor Dawkins. Any further contributions before I ask Councillor Soward to close? Councillor Soward.
Thanks, Deputy. Thanks, councillors, for the points that you've raised. I want to just make a couple of additional points. In getting this alternative motion prepared, I'm going to say I actually didn't create this myself. I didn't I'm not a planner. I actually enlisted the help of Director Hurst and her team, and it spells out very, very clearly in the alternative motion the things that need to happen. And that's why I took that to the proponent to see if they were happy with that. And the email trail that Mr Jamieson and Director Hurst forwarded that on to me, and they made it very clear that they hadn't taken that to the proponent. The proponent has seen these. In the documentation, Deputy, that has been circulated that we're debating at the moment, it says about amended plans required. It spells out about a site landscaping plan. It talks about, as very well picked up by Councillor Harris, the changed parking arrangement, the different rubbish bin arrangements. It's all there. We're not arguing. I'm not saying let's pass this with what was in front of us in the other thing. It's different. That's why it's called an alternative motion. So I just wanted to make that really clear, Deputy. What we're talking about here is something that's been some extra information put in it. It's been done by our staff, and I again pay credit to them. They had an initial recommendation, and they've come up with this one as well. They've looked at it with a different lens. So I thank them for what they've done in providing the alternative motion for us. An interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to seeing how councillors vote. I'll just finish by saying Councillor Dakin is right on the mark when he's talking about the shortages of this type of property and suitable housing close to the hospital. So, I mean, here it is. Here it is. It's there. It's what we're looking at right now. There are other unit developments in the area as well, and I would add not as quality as this either. In Canole Court, bottom end of Walter Street, nothing like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Soward. Bearing in mind, of course, there can only be one recommended motion, and that was the one that was designed by the officers. General Manager, to you before we take the vote.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. And with the greatest of respect, the staff position and the professional advice obviously is what was recommended in the agenda. So we've assisted, in this case, the councillor to prepare an alternate motion based on their views, and certainly we're happy to help and will help councillors to do that whenever requested. But the council staff's position remains as was outlined in the council agenda. So I just wanted to clarify that before, so that people are clear on that.
Okay, we'll now take the vote. Those in favour, please raise their hand. That's 5 for the motion from Alderman Soward. Those against, raise their hand. No. Those against, raise their hand. Those abstaining, raise their hand.
Only because I forgot the first time. I wanted to support him.
Okay. So, General Manager, some advice. We had someone who forgot to vote.
Well, I thought we were voting on a motion that was different. So
we'll take the vote again. Those in favour of the alternate motion as provided from Alderman Soward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those against that motion, raise your hand. 5. That motion is carried. Now get the Mayor to return.
She didn't have one.
Back to you, Mayor.
So we now move on to item 8.4. We do have a speaker. 8.4. George Walker.
Thank you, Mayor and councillors. George Walker, 7 Project Crescent, Nord. Planning consultant 60 Degrees, and I'm speaking on behalf of Catholic Care. Primarily to provide additional background information in support of the draft amendment and dwelling development. Catholic Care is a not-for-profit organisation. They offer a range of community services throughout Tasmania. The core service of Catholic Care is the provision of affordable community housing projects across Tasmania. Catholic Care is currently engaged to deliver the Better Housing Futures Tasmania program, which is operated under the auspices of Housing Tasmania. The site at St Leonard's is currently operated by Catholic Care for affordable housing. The 8 conjoined multiple dwellings that form part of the application before you will be used for transitional housing purposes. Transitional housing is an intermediate type of accommodation for people who are seeking permanent accommodation. It's a supply of this type of accommodation is currently limited in Tasmania's housing system. Occupants of the dwellings will be supported with a variety of programs to assist with the transition into permanent accommodation. The programs will be delivered on site by Catholic Care staff. An objective of the Northern Regional Land Use Strategy is for the region to facilitate a variety of housing options to meet diverse community needs and to assist with housing choice and affordability. The general residential zone in the planning scheme encourages residential use and development that delivers a range of dwelling types at varying intensities. The dwellings have been purposefully designed to meet the needs of the occupants of transitional accommodation, whilst being consistent with standards in the planning scheme. They will provide a form of housing that is currently high demand within our community.
Thank you. Do we have someone to move a motion? Moved, Councillor Finlay. Seconded, Councillor Dawkins. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Finlay?
Thank you, Mayor. A little about the process first before the application before us. The process is we receive this today. We're considering both the amendment and the development application at the same time. It will go out for consultation and then any comments come back for referral on. The development application, I would say, subject to the previous consideration of council of multiple development for a range of living occupations, I suggest is going to be clearly supported today. I think it is appropriate in this instance where it is supported living in a transitional environment that the tightness of its application to our planning scheme is considered in positive light, given that it's supported social housing. I think it is an appropriate development on an appropriate site in an appropriate area and much needed within our community.
Thank you. Councillor Dawkins. Any other councillor wish to speak? Councillor Spencer.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. When we went out there to look at this project, the only thing that concerned me is how they're going to fence the main road. I don't want a 6 foot high fence where neighbours look at that. It's probably needed, but it's a very small block with a heap of units on it. I think it could be all right if they can make a nice looking fence that doesn't upset the neighbours. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McKenzie.
Thanks, Mayor. And again, I endorse the intent of the application. I think that the officers have explained to us the need for this, well, not the need for this property, but this property would ordinarily probably be under residential zoning had we been reviewing it. We also looked at the tract history in relation to the previous development, which was done outside of the planning scheme to develop that, which had much hue and cry at the time. But as time's gone on, that matter seems to have settled down and been accepted by the community. The slight difference between that one and this one, I think, is that the facing onto the front road, I think, is the key issue, and I take Councillor Spencer's notes or comments in relation to the fence. To me, when this goes out for conversation, we are likely to get feedback in relation to that from the people who live directly opposite. So to me, the objective is to try and get a win-win situation by trying to make sure that the housing is appropriate and meets the needs of the community and the supported community that Catholic Care are endeavouring to deal with. But at the same token, come out with a situation where that's shielded or at least adequately screened to ensure that anybody in the neighbourhood doesn't sort of get affronted by the fact that there's a butt ugly building looking at them, and therefore having impacts on values and all sorts of different things that people will raise with us when this comes back from development. Now, I know in the application that there is a fencing requirement of up to 1.8 metres with 30% transparency, which I think is a legislative requirement, but it also says a site landscaping plan. So I would take it upon the officers that when this does come back, that we look at the landscaping plan to sort of also meet the requirements in and around the fencing to try and screen that development from the roadside and therefore the neighbours on the other side of the road. So I'm happy to support it today, see what comes back from the consultation, and then maybe there's some further amendments we need to make based on those comments.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Walker.
Just to clarify the process from here, that if this was to be approved today, that it would go out for community consultation, and that essentially we're not approving the development application.
Just to clarify that?
We are. I think
we are,
aren't we?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So
Richard will go through the process.
Yeah.
Thank you.
today we are initiating an amendment and giving approval to a development application. We will then put that on advertising and we will get the comments. The officers will write a report for the council's consideration, and the council can then give a statement of its opinion on what to do with the representations. So in principle, council could change its mind and recommend to the commission that the DA be refused, but it won't alter the fact that it's approved the DA by this decision. And it will go through, should council initiate it today, it will go through to the commission, and the commission will ultimately make a decision on it. If there's lots of representations, there'll likely be a hearing, and then council officers and the community representations can go, but the ultimate decision on the merits will be made by the commission, taking into account council's views.
Thank you. Speak or?
To continue,
yep.
Yes, that's okay. It would appear that that this development application does comply with the code, and yet there seems to be some issues in regards to the size of the individual units and their what would you call outdoor space and things like that go with it. That there's a discretionary aspect to that in this particular application. Would that be correct?
Normally you'd speak, use your time, and then we'll answer the questions at the end, if you don't mind.
Very good. Then I've used my time and answer away.
That's all right. Thank you.
I just want some clarification.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, then you just do questions. It's easier. Yeah, clarity around the question. You could just stand and ask the question.
Just to clarify which area, I apologise for the delay. It's in regards to the compliance of the. I just can't find the actual section. I think it must be earlier in the size of the dwellings in relation to the their outside area. I think it's. I just can't find the section now. I'm sorry. And I just thought there was some ambiguity, or sort of, even though it does list that it complies, that there are points that. Okay. In regards to the depth of the spaces for dwellings 1, 5 and 7 do not comply with Part B. Part B being having a minimum horizontal dimension of 4 metres and so on and so on. So this is all under... I don't know, I'm still trying. 10.4, is it? Really? 10.3. I don't know, I'm reading it. 10.4.3, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, that would be the one. Site coverage and private open space for all dwellings. Thank you.
I think the important thing to take into here is that this isn't housing that's destined for the general housing stock. This is provided for the specific needs of occupants. In the performance criteria, it allows council to consider the reasonable needs of the future occupants, and these are small single dwelling units for people in need of temporary housing. Now, that's not to say that they don't have an open space need, but arguably it's less than a permanent resident who's got their life in a particular house or a place. They'll be transient. And so the view that the officers have taken is that their reasonable needs is less for people who are in that situation.
Thank you. No, speak or question?
Point of clarity.
Yes?
Yes.
Question?
Then, in this case, then, is this a discretionary aspect?
Yes, it is a discretion. Yes. So
Thank you.
councillors have recommended that officers have recommended that council exercise discretion on those points.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Anyone else? No? You got a question? No?
Just would then encourage councillors to consider that by putting 8 units on this block, which is not a large area, and they are small units, that there may be some consideration to the idea that maybe 8 is a little too many, or maybe that the design is such that, yes, of course, I appreciate the use that the officers are taking into consideration, and that there is a need for that. And I suppose it's similar to the last EO that we looked at. There's a need for inner city dwellings. People will use them. If we use that argument for everything, I'd be, quite sure that there'd be some horrendous results. Purely using this argument that because there is a need for this, therefore we must approve. I'd be interested to hear whether one less unit would make a huge difference, whether multi-storey units would make a huge difference, all sorts of things in that regard. So I'd ask fellow councillors to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other councillors wish to speak? Councillor Finlay, wish to close?
Thanks, Mayor. And I think the questions from Councillor Walker are reasonable and should be considered in consideration of this item. And even with the discretions that we're being asked to consider, when we apply a question of reasonableness, I think it still is appropriate for this development to be approved for the reasons which are quite different to the previous item that we considered, where in fact you're asking exactly the same question: would one less provide for greater amenity? When, in my mind, in reading this and in reading the recommendations of the officer, when someone is seeking to reside in a home for a period of time, then their livability and the livable amenity of that area is high and important, and discretion should be considered with sound reason for that, I believe. The nature of the accommodation that is being recommended here and the supported environment associated with that and it's only approved, and I think the words are important, that the approval is for, and now I'm not going to be able to find it, the approval is for transitional accommodation, so it is only to be used, it can only ever be used for short-term accommodation, so even if it passes on, the approval is for that use, and so it would never be for a long-term home for an individual. And so I believe that the amenity is shelter, and that's the primary concern that we're seeking to address here for members of the community that at the moment don't have certain shelter or security of shelter, and so that's what we're providing, which I think is reasonable. And in fact, if I'm correct, on page 105, the assessment of the private open space relies on an A and if not B, and B is that there be 12 metres in total area, and they all exceed the 12 metres. However, they need to have a lineal dimension of 4 metres, and there are 3 of them that are 3.8. So when you're asked for consideration of reasonableness, 20 centimetres as the difference between what is actually would meet the requirements of the scheme versus what doesn't, actually the discretion's not significant. So in my mind, if I've interpreted that correctly, yes, we're being asked to cause for discretion, but sometimes, and each on its own merit at the time, a setback from a boundary might be cut in half. That's significant discretion being requested, and then we have to ask for reasonableness. So because of the approval given to this, which is only for transitional ever, and we've talked a couple of times when we've been on bus trips about approving for the property, not the people. So in this case, I'm sort of going backwards on that, and it's about why is this intended? But the use will only ever transfer for transitional accommodation. It won't ever, under this approval, be for permanent homes. So in my mind, the amenity of the area, it is landscaped private space. There is landscaping in the area. There are places that are walkable to get to parks just around the corner. There's public recreation space around. I believe that the reasonableness of the discretions we're being asked for is warranting approval.
Thank you. I was just about to say your time is up. You did very well. I'll put it to the vote. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Those against? One against. The rest are for. That's carried. Move on to 8.5, Amendment 52. Someone happy to move? Councillor Mackenzie. Councillor Finlay, second. Councillor Mackenzie's question? You can.
I guess this is clearly saying that rather than pay up front, you can pay it over time payment, which is indexed, I think is probably the clarity of this. So I guess the risk is that we as a council are spending money up front and getting paid later on. As being indexed, we're hopefully better off, we're no worse off as a result of that. But I guess we run the risk that if the development fails somewhere down the track, we don't get paid for the infrastructure. Is that my understanding of how it is?
Thank you. Richard.
We spent the money quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
So the money is already out, and the indexing is the thing that's making the development unviable, because the debt is far more than council incurred because of the indexing. And to pay that up front in a development in cash before you've got an approval is the thing that's thwarting the intent of it. So council spent the money with the view to facilitate the development because it needed a roundabout, and the individual property owners couldn't facilitate that between themselves. So council stepped in and built the roundabout. We anticipated it to develop quicker. The problem here is that the amount of money now is in the hundreds of thousands, multiple, well, over 500,000 for one of the parcels, which is an enormous amount of money in our context to pay up front before you have an approval. So the idea here is not to reduce the amount, but to give flexibility for council to consider the point in time which it's paid. And that might be in stages, or it might be, for example, when a block is sealed to create the title. So, but that would be subject to further discussions. This isn't in the context of any particular request at the moment, but there has been concerns expressed from individuals, landowners, that the current system is the thing that's preventing the development happening, which is clearly not in anyone's interests.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's how I understood it. So thank you. So I guess that to me, it's a practical thing to try and improve the ability for development to continue to get done. We need to actually go out there and do certain infrastructure to make things able to be done. And I think that in working with developers, I mean, there's the risk, and I guess in this particular case we haven't been paid anything for a long period of time, which has now meant that the value has gone up significantly. So I get the context of that. So I think that provided that there's strong management and the criteria is solid around how we do this with the developer, so they know when they go in as to how this is going to be done. I don't know whether there's any way that we can actually do this in conjunction with taking liens over property. Is that something that we should be looking at doing to ensure that our risk is limited to the fact that when the lawyer gets the money to pay it out, they actually clip the ticket for us like they do with rates and taxes and things like that when we sell. So as long as we can sort of manage our risk associated with making these expenses, I think it's a sensible way to go forward, and it'll actually improve the ability of developers to do their work.
Thank you. Richard, thank you.
I just want to make the point that this is only for one specific circumstance at Raglan Street. It doesn't. It is not a general principle, and it doesn't apply to any other circumstances than the roundabout on the Kings Meadows connector. It's a provision in a specific area plan which deals with one piece of infrastructure.
Thank you. Councillor Finlay. Councillor Harris, question?
Just a question then, is there any other examples of the roundabout where the council has built infrastructure that we may have a similar thing? Because I'm just a bit worried about the precedent you may be setting, because you are allowing for the council to pay out an upfront cost, and then the developer at some future point pays back only that cost, and so we've obviously lost the value of the dollar in between. And I just wondered if there's any other examples of it, because we don't want to set a dangerous precedent, that's all.
the mechanism that's built into the planning scheme preserves the value of money by indexing at the local government rate. So that's the issue here. If they were just paying back the cost, it wouldn't be a problem. But now the interest payments, or the cumulative is more than the cost that it costs to actually build it. That's the problem. It's the passing of time that is the problem. If the development happened in the first year, there would be no problem. This mechanism is only needed because of the value of money over time. Not that I'm aware of. There are. It is likely that these circumstances will arise again in the future. But those things will have to be considered on their merits at the time. But this was a device at the time to unlock the potential for development of a land, which otherwise wouldn't have occurred. And it's well-positioned residential land, which is why it was necessary at the time. Had we, with the benefit of hindsight, we would have written it differently at the time. And we would certainly have built in the ability to have it as a per block charge, which is something that we may well consider again in the future.
Thank you. You wish to speak, Councillor Harris?
No, just a follow-up question on that. So the land that we're doing this for is the roundabout to nowhere at opposite Bunnings in Kings Meadow, so everyone is clear, because Raglan Street doesn't really help with most people. And so the development happened a long time ago, maybe 8-10 years ago from memory, and the previous owner of that land would have had that on him if he was to develop the land ultimately. But by selling it to a new developer who's now developing it, we are now taking away all of the interest payments that would have occurred or incurred since the date, or only some of the interest payments.
Richard? We're not taking away any of the interest payments.
Oh, they're still paying the interest, are they?
Yes.
Did I misunderstood that then?
No. This is
That's where your time payment comes from.
This is only about the potential to negotiate on the timing of payments, not the amount. And I think it's written such that if the payments are delayed, the interest still accrues to the point that it's paid.
Thank you. That's satisfied me nicely.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Spencer?
Thanks, Mayor. I'm just inquiring, what's the time framing paying for that off? That how many years will it take?
There are 3 parcels of land remaining that haven't had the contribution paid. One contribution has been paid. We are dealing with 2 of them at the moment. The application for subdivision for 2 parcels may well be advertised this Saturday. That leaves a 3rd parcel remaining. So should the development proceed, 4 out of the 5 parcels will have paid, and there'll be 1 outstanding. That we haven't had any development interest in the final parcel because of the circumstances of that landowner. But should it go on the market, I would expect it to be picked up and developed within a reasonable time.
Thank you.
Any other speakers? Questions? Councillor Mackenzie, wish to close? Thank you. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. We now no longer sit as a planning authority. Go to Mayor's announcements, and just a couple of things. One is obviously with Festivali a weekend ago. It was a great success, and the number of comments I had while I was there, people walking around saying how well the park looked, General Manager, and how impressed they were with the parks. I want to pass it on for our staff, and if you could pass it on to the workers there as well. Fantastic. A lot of people impressed with the city park. Then the Big Bash was a great success at UTAS Stadium. Again, the ground was in great condition and also a good crowd, so we thank the public for coming out supporting the Big Bash. And then the tennis, obviously a great weekend. And then I just want to mention on Wednesday the 6th of February, it's got attended Tas Water quarterly briefing. That's not correct because that's on this afternoon and I haven't attended. No. So that can be taken out. Thank you. Walker. Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mayor. I was privileged enough to go to Hobart on the 26th of January and speak at the Invasion Day rally in front of about, depending on which media you might follow. I would have thought well over 4,000 people in attendance. And I'd just like to acknowledge the Aboriginal community and thank them for that opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other reports? Councillor Dawkins.
Thanks. Just briefly, as a resident of Bain Terrace in Trevelyan, I would like to thank Council for the basketball court that's just been put in. It is so cool to sit out front on my veranda and hear people. I can hear them bouncing the ball on the way up, and there's so much traffic. It's that kind of community development that doesn't cost that much money, but it has a huge impact on the community. So thank you.
Well done. Thank you. Any other councillor reports? No. We'll move to questions by councillors. Councillor Spencer.
Just got a letter from Ivan Dean concerning the road down at Lilydale, near Lorena. Everyone's got this, I think. There's been 3 traffic accidents there where people have died in the last 18 months. And I was talking to Ivan this morning and he said there was another accident the next day after this last person died. I think we should follow up trying to get the state government to change the speed limit back to 70 or 80, and that needs to happen ASAP.
Thank you. General Manager, wish to comment?
Thanks, Mr Mayor. So that's Golconda Road we're talking about. So yeah, that letter was addressed to me. So that's now being looked at by officers and will come back to council for a decision, obviously in respect to lobbying for any potential changes to speed limits. So it's certainly in hand, Councillor.
Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you. Just on commenting on Councillor Dawkins' comments earlier there, I had an abatement notice served on me for bouncing basketballs in my backyard, so...
And rightly so. Rightly so.
So you may change your view over time.
Rightly so.
Just wanted to... There's been a little bit of press in relation to the helicopters that have been flying in and around the city, and I'm aware that the General Manager's received a number of bits of correspondence, but I thought just to have on record, in public record, just what the council's doing in relation to that. I'm aware there's a DA that's been lodged, but there appears to be people flying despite the DA.
Yeah, thank you. General Manager.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Really at this point all I can do is acknowledge that we have received the complaints from multiple persons and that we are currently investigating, and I will have more information to council as soon as it comes to hand.
So my second question is, I just noticed the Mayor up there closing the swimming pool yesterday, I think at the Gorge.
Announcing it, haven't closed it.
It's preeminent, but I guess the issue is I've been up to the Gorge reasonably frequently in the last little while, and I guess is just getting some confidence that all of the groundworks around the pool, as in sort of the new works, will be completed by the date of the celebration for the Qantas Tourism Awards.
I was informed while I was up there that it was going to be completed this week, but so hopefully that's on track. Otherwise, it'll be next week sometime.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further to add? That's by the workers, so.
It'll be completed and opened for the Friday night of the event, so not before.
Councillor Dakin.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. 2 questions. I think this might be to the General Manager. In relation to how the council votes, first of all, how long has council acknowledged and accepted that an abstaining vote be counted as a negative vote and not a neutral vote? My second question, possibly to the General Manager, would be, can we look to put on the agenda of our workshops a review of our council voting procedures, please?
General Manager.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Look, it's been a practice, and the Local Government Act is clear in that an abstaining vote is a vote in the negative, and so It basically comes down to making sure that we've accurately recorded it in the minutes, so that even if an alderman or councillor chooses to abstain, that it actually is recorded as a vote in the negative. But certainly it's been raised by several councillors since last meeting, so I think it's certainly something we can bring to a workshop to discuss, a meeting procedure for sure.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mayor. To slightly revisit a couple of topics. In regards to the helicopter operations, if the General Manager could just clarify which authority has jurisdiction over that, and whether and what correspondence or communications have occurred between that authority and the council, and whether the proponents, I suppose you'd call them, the operators, have been contacted at all.
General Manager.
Look, I think at the moment it is under investigation. I'm not going to go into the details with respect to what has happened and where we're at in respect to those, and I'll certainly make a full account of those available once we're comfortable that we've got all the fact to hand. What I can say is certainly the council's involvement in respect of helicopter operation in and around Launceston is limited to the helipads, so where helicopters land and take off from. In respect of the operation, obviously in the air, that's a CASA, a Civil Aviation Authority responsibility that we don't have any involvement in. So again, we are getting to the bottom of the facts of the matter, and I'd just rather not provide information until I'm fully comfortable that I have all the information. So,
thank you.
In regards to the tourist awards that are being held at the Cataract Gorge and the closing of the pool from the 15th of February, if I'm correct.
Correct.
The awards are not until early March. Is there any way, considering the rather warm spell that we're experiencing at the moment, that particular timeline can be in any way addressed? It would seem that 2.5 weeks.
2 weeks. 1st of March is when that's on.
I'm sure that these people are doing this, well cognizant of that. I just feel as though, as much as the tourist awards might be a wonderful thing for our state and for our city, the gorge is also, in high use at this time, and anything we could do to free up any additional days before and after that event would be appropriate. So,
that's been looked at, but the organisers have had to have that time to make sure that it's all ready in time.
Of course. And finally, in regards to the Cataract Gorge, I'm hopefully reliably informed that the volunteers at the Cataract Gorge Cottage have come to a position where that they're finding it would be difficult to continue as volunteers. That there's been, some talk of that program ceasing, and if I could just get some update, if any, from the director responsible for that, and an indication of what has transpired to get to that point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Eberhard. Oh, Director. Gee, I'm so conscious about council.
There has been a lot of work done with the volunteers over the last few years around what they offer to try and make them more sustainable and appropriate for what council want to achieve in the gorge. I'll need to go away and review where we're up to and come back to you on where we're actually at, but there's no intent to stop the volunteers from operating, but I do understand they've been struggling to get enough numbers to continue to offer their programs.
Thank you. Councillor Harris.
Just a question for the General Manager, as we're now in February, just a progress of where we're at with the food vans in the mall, because we were expecting them to be in there for 4 weeks in February.
Thank you. General Manager.
As obviously we discussed in the workshop with respect, we've had one response to the expressions of interest, so we're working through the details of that individual, that business in respect of their commencement date and the arrangements around that. Obviously there's the ability to look to see whether we can supplement that by another van, as we discussed in the workshop last week, when we're undertaking our investigations around that currently. So I don't think we're far away from having a start, but I'll inform council as soon as we're able. So.
Thank you. Any further questions? No, the questions on notice are there from the previous meeting with their answers. 12.1, Tender Review Committee. Someone happy to move that? Councillor Cox, seconded Councillor Mackenzie. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Cox? Councillor Mackenzie? No? I'll put the motion. Those in favour? That's carried. Thank you. We go on to 15.1, Community Grants Assessment Panel. Move Deputy Mayor. Seconded Councillor Mackenzie. Wish to speak to it, Deputy Mayor?
No, self-explanatory.
Councillor Mackenzie?
I just love it. They underline what they've changed.
Good. Any councillor wish to speak? Ask a question? You wish to close, Deputy?
Oh, just to take the opportunity to say that a round is currently open and there are amazing community projects that could well be enhanced through applying for support.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand, and that is all councillors present. 15.2, Community Grant.
Call it point of order for a moment, momentarily. Just in terms of how we progress through the agenda, and I've asked this question before, I've been given an answer before, I'm sure there will be a consistent response, but agendas item 13 and 14 went without comment, and I note the content under agenda item 13 and wish to make a positive comment around that, which I imagine is in no way different from agenda item 9.1, which is just a list of things. 13 is just a list of things. And with your leave, Mayor, I note that agenda item 13 is documented differently this time in the agenda, and I wanted to make a positive comment about the ability to outline more than just titles, because sometimes having a headline without any content does cause concern and ask for questions as a result of that. So I wanted to note the improvement in the agenda content.
Good. Thank you. That's noted. General Manager's happy with that?
Thanks. Yeah, look, it was done to comply with the new requirements and changes in the legislation. So, yeah.
Very good. Back to 15.3, delegation for council to General Manager. 15.2, sorry, Community Grants Assessment Panel. Move Deputy Mayor. Second Alderman Mackenzie. Councillor Mackenzie. You wish to speak to it, Deputy?
Just to take further what's listed there, the three representatives did a great job throughout their first year. What this does is brings it into line with the council elections and the change of rotation of committee members and committee personnel at the end of a 2-year term. So I think it's positive.
Thank you. Councillor Mackenzie.
Endorse that quality people, I think, deserving of an extra run.
Any other speakers? Can I put the motion? Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors. That's carried. Now 15.3, delegation from council. Move Councillor Cox. Second, Councillor Mackenzie. Wish to speak to it, Councillor Cox? Thank you. No. Anyone else wish to speak to it? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. That is all councillors present. That is carried. Oh, I think that is it for closed. We have a motion that we move into open. We have a motion that we move into closed. Move Councillor Sowers, second Councillor Cox. All those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. We'll now go.
Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks.
Is this being broadcast?
Yes. Yep.
Thank you. I suppose I would like to think that as a council, we are always trying to be as transparent and accountable as possible. While I can't speak to the matter in closed council, while I can't speak to the matter discussed in closed council, I appreciate, any sensitive matters in terms of, I suppose, what you would call commercial in confidence. Is that what we're suggesting? In this particular case, I would argue that there is no alternative, and it does not put anyone in a position where that is, does not put anyone in a position where their commercial confidence is being
What it does,
challenged.
You're talking about rates and what the rates will be, and it's going to go out for tender at the moment, so it's going to be, I don't think it'd be very wise to do it in that climate when we're trying to get a tender, people quoting. Anyway, that's only my view.
We might get something from mainland cheap.
Yeah, but if they're going to know what these rates are, they're not going to go cheaper. You may, maybe. Anyway, any other further comments, questions? Councillor Finlay?
Given that it's the first time that we've dealt with this and we're dealing with it at the table in real time, the commercial in confidence information that we consider when we're part of development review committee, and we consider that in a closed session, and there's the commercial content there, and then the outcome of those tender review committee meetings are brought to the table, and we've got the recommendation here before us. which is where an absolute number is publicly provided. Is there a way that we could make a decision here that at the next council meeting that appropriate recommendation is brought forward, or at a previous council, if we do it again, that similar motion is taken in closed council and considered to be brought forward, so we know what we're doing in open council before we come out of closed council? Something like that?
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
I think the quantum probably isn't in confidence, it's the rates.
Yeah.
That's right.
Correct.
So the fact is it's going to be in our budget line.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm happy with that.
So we could bring something like that forward for the next meeting?
That's a good point. So totals, yeah. You happy with that? Happier? Yeah. Councillor Harris?
So do we just say that, you know, we're extending it and put a time frame?
Yeah, we would do. I'm sure that would be part of the wording.
That's really all that needs to be put rather than any...
We can also extend the quantum as well.
Well, you could, I guess, but I wouldn't see the necessity of that.
Yeah, next council meeting will be an easy way, then it'll be thought through. Get the wording right. All right, we're happy with that? So, we're happy with that? Well, that motion needs to be changed.
We can change the motion so that it documents, we can make a decision now. Sorry, you could make a decision now that in relation to the closed council agenda item, curbside, blah, blah, councils endorse the decisions taken in closed council and not release the detailed information to the public as it may prejudice the commercial position of the person who supplied it, but advise that
The details, total.
the total contract, the contract extension to the April 2020
Will be brought to the next council meeting.
and the total of the amount, the total of the contract increase is 342. And we can put the additional contract amount in there. So you could make that decision today and we wouldn't need to bring it back to next meeting.
So what do you feel? You want to do that decision today or next meeting? Today? We're happy for that? We'll get the wording right then. We'll need to make sure. So where did that change?
Closed in the last council meeting, so
nobody told me. Just remind you all we are on air, and you can hear me outside. Conversations that are going. Yes, someone happy to... Oh, we did have a mover, didn't we? We had Kenzie, wasn't it? Yeah. Councillor Stojanczyk and Spencer, I think, wasn't it? So Councillor Stojanczyk and Spencer as mover and seconder. Are you happy with that still, to be mover and seconder?
So moving forward, will we devise a motion as part of our closed council.
Yeah, no, General Manager, it should have been done.
Yeah, apologies. It's clunky the way that we've done it. It actually got missed in the agenda when we picked it up this morning, but it wasn't there. So apologise for that. We are complying. This is the first closed session we've had since the legislative change, so we'll improve from here.
Thank you. So, yes, Councillor Spencer.
One question. I just want to know why this wasn't tendered out 12, 18 months ago before the contract finished.
Well,
So the process started probably about 6 months ago, and given the significance in change in the way the contract's structured, it's really taken 6 months worth of work to get here to allow sufficient time. So we're talking really a 2-year plus lead time, and I guess we just weren't thinking that far ahead. It's quite possible that a new contract will be in place by the end of December. But we just want to make sure we've got the flexibility so we can get the best outcome going forward.
So if that contract come up in December, would these guys still got this for
So they've still got the garbage collection until the 31st of December. Yep. If we can find someone before, the recycling can change before that. Yep.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Even though we've probably been past it, we're on to this motion now. Anyone on this motion? We had a mover and a Councillor Harris.
Just on that motion, I don't see the need for having their bit beyond the 30th of April to 2020. There's no need for financials. I think you could delete that and just simply say we're extending it. Let them read the financial reports and the budgets and that to find it. I just don't, because it may not happen to be those amounts, because if we have a...
Yeah, no, he's speaking to it, that's right.
Yeah, so if we have a thing, I think if we could change, I would suggest we could look at changing that motion to reduce the, well, not actually put the amounts on.
Yep, thank you. Any other discussion on it?
For or against?
No, we'll vote on it in a minute, as is, and then that'll determine where people are at, won't it?
Yes, I'd like to move that as an amendment to remove that last sentence, only the last sentence from the 30th of April 2020, that we don't actually specify the amounts.
Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Spencer? Any discussion on that change? Oh, you can't second it, Councillor Spencer, because you were seconding the other motion. Is there someone happy to second it?
I second my motion to take out the money.
Councillor Dakey, thank you. Any further discussion on that? That as amending the motion, that's what we're talking about now. Councillor Walker?
I just simply don't agree. That I think there's no harm in it being there.
Thank you. Councillor Mackenzie?
And I'll agree that we're going to be totally transparent in the numbers report.
Okay, can I put it to the vote? Or Councillor Harris, you want to close on your amended motion? Not allowed to really, but anyway.
Yeah, I just think that we shouldn't be necessarily publishing numbers that may not be the case, because we may change the date. And from that, you may be able to, if you're in the industry, work out roughly what's going on. And you don't need to give that level of detail out, as we discussed it under closed council. And we need to be conscious of what that really is used for. You know, in my previous life in Telstra, we could often work out what other people's pricing was simply by the little bit that was given out. And I suspect the rubbish industry is no different.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. Those in favour of the amendment, please raise your hands. Those against? That's defeated, so we go back to the original motion. Any further discussion on the original motion? Councillor Stosnicek, you wish to close it all?
Just in terms of the finances, obviously that figure's available anyway through our budget, so I don't think it hurts having that in there. So.
I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. Those against? That's 3 against, the rest are 4. The motion is carried. I can now close the meeting. The meeting is closed. Thank you.
Breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks.